Betrayed and left practically penniless, a devoted granddaughter was ruthlessly mocked by her arrogant family for spending her last crumpled dollar on a rotting, collapsed ruin. The greedy heirs were absolutely certain they had successfully seized the massive multi-million-dollar estate, gleefully laughing as they tossed her out into a moldy dump. They had no idea the desolate wasteland they sneered at secretly harbored a staggering hidden fortune. And they never suspected this $1 joke concealed the exact weapon she needed to expose their devastating bankruptcy, obliterate their smug expectations, and claim an $85 million legacy they could never touch. The mahogany-paneled office of attorney Gregory Finch smelled of expensive leather, stale coffee, and unspoken greed. Beatrice Hayes sat rigidly in a wingback chair that was far too large for her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Across the heavy oak desk sat her aunt, Lucille Harrington, draped in a cashmere shawl that cost more than Beatrice's entire net worth, and Lucille's son, Preston. Preston was busy checking his designer watch, his mouth twisted into a permanent arrogant smirk. They were here for the final reading of Arthur Pendleton's will. Arthur was Beatrice's grandfather, a man she had spent the last 5 years feeding, bathing, and reading to while his mind slowly surrendered to age. Lucille and Preston had not visited him once in those 5 years. Yet, as Attorney Finch cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles, the cruel reality of the law was about to be laid bare. To my daughter, Lucille, and my grandson, Preston, Finch read, his voice monotone. I leave the entirety of the Pendleton estate, including the main manor house in Newport, all liquid assets, and the controlling shares in Pendleton Manufacturing. Lucille let out a heavy theatrical sigh of relief, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. Preston actually chuckled, a low guttural sound of pure triumph. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't about the money. She hadn't cared for her grandfather expecting a massive payout. But Arthur had promised her that she would be taken care of, that her sacrifices wouldn't leave her destitute. She had quit her job as a historical archivist to be his full-time caretaker. Now, she had exactly $400 in her checking account and nowhere to live. And to my granddaughter Beatrice, Finch continued, peering over his glasses. The room went dead silent. I offer a choice. She may walk away from this table with nothing, honoring the independence she so fiercely protects. Or she may purchase the property known as the East Groundskeeper's Cottage, encompassing the quarter-acre of land it sits upon, for the sum of exactly $1 United States dollar. Preston burst into outright laughter. The cottage? That rotting pile of stone on the edge of the woods? The roof caved in a decade ago. It's a liability, not an asset. It is a legal transfer of deed, contingent on a nominal transaction, Finch explained coldly. Does she accept? Lucille leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. Oh, let her have it, Greg. It's fitting. She always did like playing in the dirt. It's practically a favor to us, saves Preston the demolition costs. Beatrice stared at the polished wood of the desk. The humiliation burned in her chest, hot and suffocating. They were mocking her grandfather's memory, mocking the years she had given him. But the cottage was on the estate. It was where she and Arthur used to plant hydrangeas when she was a little girl. It was a piece of him. With shaking hands, Beatrice reached into her worn canvas tote bag. She pulled out a battered leather wallet, unzipped the coin compartment, and extracted a single crumpled $1 bill. She smoothed it out on her knee, then leaned forward and placed it deliberately in the center of the lawyer's desk. George Washington stared up at the ceiling. I'll take it, Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking before she cleared her throat and spoke louder. I will buy the cottage, Preston sneered, standing up and buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. Enjoy the black mold, Bee. Just stay on your side of the property line. I'm bringing developers in next week to survey the manor, and I don't want you scaring them off. 2 days later, Beatrice stood before her new home. Calling it a home was a generous stretch of the English language. The East Groundskeeper's Cottage was a disaster. Built in the 1920s from local fieldstone, it was once a charming Tudor-style outbuilding. Now, ivy had strangled the masonry, tearing deep fissures into the mortar. Half of the slate roof had collapsed inward, exposing the interior to the harsh New England elements. The windows were either shattered or boarded up with rotting plywood. A cold rain began to fall as she pushed open the front door. It didn't squeak. It scraped agonizingly against warped hardwood floors. Inside, the smell of damp earth and decay was overwhelming. Leaves and debris blanketed the living room. Her grand inheritance was a literal ruin. She set her single suitcase down on a dry patch of floor near the grand stone fireplace. She had no electricity, no running water, and only a camp stove to cook on. As the sun set, plunging the cottage into near-total darkness, Beatrice huddled in her sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the roof. For the first time since her grandfather's funeral, she broke down and wept. She felt utterly, completely defeated. The $1 joke was on her. By the end of the first week, survival had replaced sorrow. Beatrice, drawing on a stubborn reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, had turned the cottage's only intact room, the old kitchen, into a functional base camp. She spent her days clearing debris, hauling out rotten furniture, and scrubbing away decades of grime. Her hands were blistered, her nails chipped and packed with dirt, but the physical labor kept her mind from spiraling into despair. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that the sleek black Range Rover pulled up to the overgrown dirt path leading to the cottage. Preston stepped out, meticulously avoiding a mud puddle in his Italian leather loafers. He looked at Beatrice, who was currently wielding a heavy crowbar trying to pry up a section of water-damaged floorboards near the kitchen pantry. "Still playing pioneer, I see," Preston called out, his voice dripping with condescension. He stepped into the doorway, refusing to enter further. "I'll make this quick, Beatrice. The developers from Sterling Oaks Construction are drawing up the new blueprints for the estate. They want to put the main gated entrance right through this eyesore." "It's not an eyesore, Preston," Beatrice said, leaning on the crowbar and wiping a streak of soot from her forehead. "It's my property. You sold it to me, remember?" "I humored a senile old man's ridiculous will," Preston corrected sharply. "Look, I'm not completely heartless. The demolition crew is coming next Thursday. I'll give you $5,000 right now to sign the deed over to my LLC and walk away. That's 5,000 times what you paid for it. Go rent a nice apartment in the city. Leave the real estate to the adults." Beatrice tightened her grip on the iron bar. $5,000 would solve all her immediate problems. It would mean a hot shower, a warm bed, and food that didn't come out of a tin can. But looking at Preston's smug, expectant face, she felt a surge of pure defiance. He didn't want to help her. He just wanted to erase the last trace of her from the family legacy. "The cottage isn't for sale," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register. Preston's smile vanished, his face flushed with sudden anger. "Don't be a stubborn idiot, Bea. You have no water, no power, and no money. You can't legally live here once the town inspector sees the state of the foundation. Take the money, or I'll have the county condemn the building and seize it through eminent domain. You'll get absolutely nothing. Get off my property, Preston." He stared at her for a long, tense moment, his jaw clenching. "Fine. Freeze to death in this dump. You always were a loser." He spun on his heel, marched back to his luxury SUV, and sped off, kicking up a spray of gravel. Beatrice stood trembling with adrenaline and rage. She turned back to the ruined floorboards, channeling her fury into the heavy iron crowbar. She swung it down hard, intending to shatter a warped piece of oak. Instead of a dull thud of wood, the impact sent a jarring metallic shockwave up her arms. Clang. Beatrice stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She frowned, dropping to her knees and brushing away a thick layer of decomposed leaves and rat droppings. She had assumed the cottage sat on a simple dirt crawlspace, but as she swept the debris aside, the dim light from the window caught the dull gleam of rusted metal. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. She grabbed the crowbar and furiously pried away the remaining floorboards, tossing them carelessly over her shoulder. Beneath the floor of the old pantry wasn't dirt. It was a heavy, square iron grate, approximately 3 foot wide. The edges were sealed with years of accumulated grime, and a massive, antique brass padlock secured a heavy latch on one side. Beatrice sat back on her heels, staring at it. Why would a simple groundskeeper's cottage have a fortified trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards? This wasn't a root cellar. The metal was too thick, the lock too complex. Her mind raced back to her grandfather's final days. His mind had been fractured, slipping between past and present. He had muttered things that made no sense at the time. Don't let them have the foundation, Bea. The foundation is everything. Keep the key, the $1 key. She had thought it was just dementia, but looking at the brass lock, a wild, impossible thought sparked in her mind. She ran to her suitcase, digging frantically through her meager belongings until she found her grandfather's old leather jacket, the one he insisted she keep. She reached into the lining pocket, her fingers closing around a small, heavy object. She pulled it out, an old, ornate brass key that had been attached to the same key ring as the cottage's front door key. Finch had handed it to her without a second glance. Hands shaking uncontrollably, Beatrice knelt beside the iron grate. She blew the dust out of the padlock's keyhole. She inserted the brass key. It slid in perfectly. With a deep breath, she turned it. A loud, satisfying click echoed in the empty cottage. The lock popped open. The iron grate was incredibly heavy. It took every ounce of Beatrice's strength, leveraging the crowbar under the lip of the trap door, to finally heave it upward. It fell back against the remaining floorboards with a thunderous crash that sent a cloud of ancient dust billowing into the air. Beatrice coughed, waving her hands to clear the air, and looked down. A set of narrow, steep stone steps descended into absolute suffocating darkness. A blast of cold, stale air rushed up to greet her, carrying the metallic scent of old water and undisturbed earth. It didn't smell like sewage or rot. It smelled like history. She retrieved a heavy-duty LED flashlight from her camping gear, clicked it on, and aimed the brilliant white beam down into the void. The light illuminated about 20 feet of descending stairs before hitting a solid brick floor. The walls of the stairwell were reinforced with thick timber and mortared stone. This wasn't a sinkhole or a crude bunker. It was a professionally engineered subterranean structure. "What were you doing down here, Grandpa?" she whispered to the empty room. Equipped with her flashlight, a spare set of batteries in her pocket, and the heavy crowbar for protection, Beatrice slowly descended, her boots scuffed against the stone, the sound amplifying in the tight, enclosed space. When she reached the bottom, she panned the flashlight around. She was standing in a narrow corridor, roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. The walls were lined with old brick, arched elegantly at the ceiling to support the weight of the earth above. Thick black power cables, long dead, ran along the upper corner. But the most shocking discovery wasn't the tunnel itself. It was its direction. Beatrice had an excellent sense of spatial awareness. The cottage faced south. The stairs had led her north. This tunnel was heading straight, cutting directly under the property line, heading squarely toward the sprawling grounds of the Pendleton Manor. She began to walk. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of her boots. As she moved deeper, the temperature plummeted. She checked her watch. She had been walking for at least 3 minutes. She had to be hundreds of yards past the cottage by now, deep beneath the manicured lawns that Preston was so eager to sell to developers. The tunnel wasn't empty. Along the way, she passed small alcoves cut into the brick. Inside them were wooden crates stenciled with faded, barely legible dates from the 1920s and 30s Prohibition era. Her grandfather had always joked that his father, Beatrice's great-grandfather, had made his real fortune running rum from the Canadian border down to Rhode Island, but the family had always dismissed it as tall tales to entertain a child. Suddenly, the beam of her flashlight caught something reflective in the distance. Beatrice picked up her pace. The tunnel abruptly widened into a small antechamber. Dead ahead stood a massive reinforced steel door, the kind you would expect to see on a bank vault, not buried beneath a New England estate. The door was locked, but the mechanism wasn't on the other side. The heavy steel throw bolts and the rotary wheel were on her side. Someone had designed this tunnel so that it could only be opened from the cottage, not from the manor. Setting her jaw, Beatrice grabbed the cold steel wheel with both hands. She gritted her teeth and pulled. With a screech of metal that practically vibrated in her teeth, the wheel began to turn. The heavy bolts retracted with a series of loud, echoing thuds. She leaned her shoulder against the steel and pushed. The door swung open smoothly on heavily greased hinges, revealing the darkness beyond. Beatrice stepped through the threshold, sweeping her flashlight across the room. She gasped, dropping the crowbar. It clattered loudly against a polished hardwood floor. She wasn't in a dark, dirty cellar. She was standing in a perfectly preserved secret study. The room was vast. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves packed tightly with leather-bound volumes. In the center of the room sat a massive executive desk identical to the one in Attorney Finch's office, but infinitely more beautiful. A thick Persian rug covered the floor, and a crystal chandelier hung from the reinforced ceiling, though it was dark and lifeless. But it was what was on the desk that made Beatrice's knees weak. Stacked in neat, precise towers were hundreds of identical black lockboxes. Beside them lay a series of thick, leather-bound ledgers. And right in the center of the desk, illuminated perfectly by the beam of her flashlight, was a large, sealed manila envelope. Written on the front in her grandfather's unmistakable, sprawling handwriting were 3 words: "For Beatrice." Finally, hands shaking violently, Beatrice set the flashlight down on the desk so it illuminated the envelope. She broke the wax seal and slid out a stack of documents. The paper on top was a letter dated 3 years prior, right around the time Arthur's mind had supposedly begun to fail him. "My dearest B," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means 2 things. First, it means I have passed on, and for that, I am sorry I cannot be there to hold your hand. Second, it means you refuse to let the vultures take the cottage, proving you possess the very fire and loyalty they lack. Lucille and Preston believe they have won. They believe I lost my mind, squandered the family fortune, and left them in a state rich in land, but drowning in debt. They have been trying to declare me incompetent for years, plotting to sell the manor to developers and cast me into a home. But I am not crazy, B, and I am certainly not broke." Beatrice flipped to the next page, her breath catching in her throat. The wealth of the Pendleton family was never in the manor house. It was in the assets, the bearer bonds, the original gold reserves from my father's import business. When I realized what Lucille and Preston were planning, I spent 2 years quietly liquidating the family's true assets. I moved everything out of the banks and into the old Prohibition vault beneath the property, the very vault that is only accessible from the groundskeeper's cottage. I legally transferred the ownership of this vault and everything inside it to a blind trust, a trust that is activated by one single condition: the legal ownership of the East groundskeeper's cottage. Beatrice dropped the letter onto the desk, her hands flying to her mouth as the magnitude of her grandfather's genius washed over her. She wasn't just standing in a secret room. She was standing in the true Pendleton estate. She reached out and snapped open the latches of the nearest black lockbox. The heavy lid fell back. Inside, stacked perfectly, were rows upon rows of pristine high-denomination bearer bonds, alongside heavy canvas bags that clinked with the unmistakable heavy sound of solid gold. The $1 cottage hadn't been a cruel joke. It was a map, and Beatrice had just found the treasure. The silence of the subterranean study was deafening, broken only by Beatrice's ragged breathing. She stood paralyzed, the beam of her flashlight casting long, distorted shadows across the mountains of wealth. The sheer magnitude of what her grandfather had orchestrated was dizzying. She forced her trembling legs to move, stepping closer to the massive mahogany desk. She picked up the remaining pages of Arthur's letter. Her eyes scanned his elegant, sloping cursive, absorbing the full extent of his final masterpiece. "I knew they would never value the cottage," the letter continued. "Lucille has always despised history, and Preston only values what he can immediately flaunt. They view wealth as a weapon, Beatrice. I view it as a foundation. By binding the true liquid assets of the Pendleton family to the deed of the East groundskeeper's cottage, I have ensured that only someone with reverence for our past could secure our future. Inside the bottom drawer of this desk, you will find a secondary set of keys and a contact card for Thomas Reynolds at the firm Reynolds, Shaw and Partners in Boston. Thomas is the only other living soul who knows of this trust. He has been acting as the blind executor. Take the bearer bonds. They are untraceable and fully legal, and bring them to him. He will help you activate the trust. Do not let them intimidate you, my brave girl. The war is not over yet. They will come for the land, but you hold the fortress." Beatrice opened the bottom drawer. Exactly as promised, a heavy iron keyring and a crisp white business card rested inside. She grabbed a heavy canvas tote bag she had found resting on one of the leather armchairs and began carefully packing it. She placed the trust documents inside, followed by 10 of the pristine high-denomination bearer bonds. Each one was a piece of vintage financial history backed by the federal government and redeemable for a small fortune. She closed the lockboxes, wiped her tears of overwhelming gratitude, and sealed the heavy vault door behind her. The walk back through the dark, cold tunnel felt entirely different now. It was no longer a tomb, it was a birthright. When Beatrice emerged back into the ruined kitchen of the cottage, dawn was just beginning to paint the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. She locked the heavy iron grate, meticulously replaced the damaged floorboards, and swept the debris back over them to conceal the seams. Exhausted but vibrating with adrenaline, she collapsed onto her sleeping bag. She awoke hours later, not to the sound of birds, but to the violent, earth-shaking roar of heavy diesel engines. Beatrice bolted upright. The cottage was vibrating. Dust rained down from the exposed rafters. She threw on her boots and scrambled out the front door. Less than 50 yards away, chewing up the muddy driveway, was a massive yellow Caterpillar bulldozer. Behind it, a flatbed truck was unloading a backhoe. Standing near the edge of the property line, flanked by 2 men in hard hats, was Preston. He was holding a rolled-up blueprint and pointing directly at her home. Beatrice's blood ran cold, then immediately boiled. He had said Thursday. It was only Wednesday morning. He was trying to demolish the cottage while she was still inside, forcing an illegal eviction through sheer intimidation and destruction. She sprinted across the overgrown lawn, placing herself directly in the path of the advancing bulldozer. She crossed her arms, staring up at the driver in the cab. The driver, a burly man in a neon vest, hit the brakes, the massive tread skidding in the mud and stopping just 10 feet from her. "What do you think you're doing?" Beatrice screamed over the deafening idle of the engine. Preston jogged over, his face a mask of feigned innocence, masking pure venom. "Beatrice, you're still here. I told you we were starting site prep. The developers wanted to get an early jump on the grading." "You don't own this land, Preston," she shouted, her voice echoing against the trees. "I have the deed. You take one more step onto this quarter-acre, and I am calling the police for criminal trespassing and attempted vehicular assault." Preston sneered, gesturing to the foreman. "Turn it off, Gary." The engine died, leaving a ringing silence in the damp morning air. Preston stepped close to Beatrice, lowering his voice so the crew couldn't hear. "Listen to me, you pathetic little hoarder. I spoke to Judge Miller last night. He's a friend of my mother's. He's signing an emergency condemnation order for this structure as a public hazard this afternoon. By tomorrow morning, the county will tear it down whether you're standing in front of it or not. You want to play hardball? I will bury you under this rotting wood." Beatrice stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at her cousin, at the tailored suit, the arrogant smirk, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. He had no idea what was beneath his feet. "Get your machines off my property," Beatrice said, her voice eerily calm. You have exactly 10 minutes before I have the sheriff out here to impound them. Preston laughed, a harsh grating sound. You're crazy, just like the old man. He turned to the foreman. Leave the equipment here. We'll be back at sunrise tomorrow with the sheriff and the court order. Let's see her argue with a wrecking ball. As Preston's luxury SUV disappeared down the road, Beatrice didn't waste a second. She grabbed her tote bag, her grandfather's keys, and ran to her beat-up Honda Civic. She had less than 24 hours to spring Arthur's trap. The drive to Boston took 3 agonizing hours in heavy traffic. She arrived at the towering glass and steel skyscraper of Reynolds, Shaw, and Partners just before noon. The receptionist looked at Beatrice's mud-splattered jeans and exhausted face with barely concealed disdain. But the moment Beatrice handed over the crisp white business card, the woman's demeanor instantly shifted. Within minutes, Beatrice was escorted into a sprawling, panoramic corner office overlooking the Boston Harbor. Thomas Reynolds, a distinguished man in his late 60s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, stood up from behind his desk. Miss Hayes, Reynolds said softly, a warm, knowing smile spreading across his face. I have been waiting for you for 3 years. Beatrice unzipped her tote bag and placed the thick stack of bearer bonds and her grandfather's handwritten letter on his polished glass desk. Preston is bringing a wrecking ball to the cottage tomorrow morning. He claims he has an emergency condemnation order from a judge. Reynolds adjusted his glasses, examining the bonds with expert precision. Ah, Arthur was right. They are moving fast, but they are moving blindly. He walked over to a secure filing cabinet, spun a complex combination dial, and withdrew a thick leather-bound portfolio. Your grandfather, Beatrice, was a financial savant, Reynolds explained, spreading the documents across the desk. He knew exactly what Lucille and Preston were after, the prestige of the manor and the corporate shares. What they didn't know is that over the last decade of his life, Arthur quietly leveraged everything. Beatrice frowned, trying to follow the legal jargon. Leveraged? You mean he borrowed against it? He took out a $40 million mortgage against the Newport Manor, the corporate holdings, and the surrounding estate, Reynolds said, his eyes gleaming with professional admiration. I used that $40 million to purchase the untraceable gold and bearer bonds you found in the vault, which he safely transferred into the blind trust attached to your cottage. The realization hit Beatrice like a physical blow. The breath left her lungs. Wait, so if the wealth is in the trust, what did Lucille and Preston inherit? Reynolds smiled, a sharp, predatory grin of a lawyer about to spring an inescapable trap. They inherited the debt, Beatrice. Arthur intentionally defaulted on the loan payment 6 months before he passed. The grace period expired yesterday. Morgan Stanley is initiating a full asset seizure and foreclosure on the manor as we speak. Preston and Lucille don't own a multi-million-dollar estate. They own $40 million of immediately callable debt. They are, for all legal intents and purposes, completely bankrupt. Beatrice stared at the documents, her mind racing. But the cottage? The quarter-acre containing the cottage was legally subdivided and severed from the main estate 30 years ago. It is debt-free, and because you are the legal owner of the cottage, you are now the sole beneficiary of the Pendleton Heritage Trust, which means, Miss Hayes, you currently have roughly $85 million in liquid assets at your immediate disposal. Beatrice sat down heavily in one of the plush leather chairs. The $1 cottage, the mockery, the cruel laughter in Gregory Finch's office. It had all been an elaborate, perfectly executed illusion. So, Reynolds said, picking up his desk phone, I suggest we take a trip to Newport. I have a federal judge on speed dial who will gladly issue a permanent injunction against any local condemnation order. Shall we go save your house, Beatrice? The morning air was thick with mist and the sharp scent of damp pine. At exactly 7:00 a.m., the roar of the diesel engines returned to the East groundskeeper's cottage. Beatrice stood on the small, rotting porch, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Beside her stood Thomas Reynolds, impeccably dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase. Preston's Range Rover tore down the dirt path, followed closely by a Newport County Sheriff's cruiser. Preston leaped out of his car before it was even fully in park. He was holding a crisp legal document, his face flushed with triumphant glee. Lucille stepped out of the passenger side, wearing oversized sunglasses and a fur-trimmed coat, ready to watch the spectacle. "Time's up, B," Preston shouted over the idling backhoe. He marched toward the porch, flanked by a hesitant-looking sheriff. "I have a signed condemnation order from Judge Miller. This structure is officially a hazard, and you are officially trespassing. Sheriff, remove her." The sheriff placed a hand on his belt, stepping forward awkwardly. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to vacate the premises. We don't want any trouble." Before Beatrice could speak, Thomas Reynolds stepped smoothly to the edge of the porch. "Sheriff, my name is Thomas Reynolds, senior partner at Reynolds, Shaw and Partners. I would strongly advise you not to lay a hand on my client, nor allow that machinery to move another inch." Preston scoffed. "Who is this guy, B? You hired a strip mall lawyer with your waitress tips?" "The order is signed. Tear it down." Reynolds opened his briefcase and produced a thick stack of documents stamped with federal seals. He handed the first page directly to the sheriff. "What you are holding, officer, is a federal emergency injunction overturning the local county order. Furthermore, this is a property survey confirming that the land this cottage sits on is legally protected under a historical preservation trust." The sheriff read the paper, his eyes widening. He immediately stepped back, holding up a hand to the bulldozer driver to kill the engine. "Mr. Pendleton, this is a federal injunction. My hands are tied. You need to back off." Preston's face twisted in rage. He snatched the paper from the sheriff's hands, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. "This is fake. This is a delay tactic. You don't have the money to fight me in court, Beatrice. I own the estate. I have millions." "Actually, Preston," Reynolds interrupted, his voice dropping into a register of icy authority, "you don't own anything." Lucille lowered her sunglasses, glaring at the lawyer. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are talking to?" "I am talking to the soon-to-be former occupants of the Pendleton Manor," Reynolds stated calmly. He pulled another set of documents from his briefcase, thick red-stamped foreclosure notices. "As the executor of Arthur Pendleton's secondary affairs, I am here to inform you that Morgan Stanley has officially called in the $40 million collateralized loan your father took out against the estate, because you accepted the inheritance under Attorney Finch's guidance without conducting a proper probate audit. You assumed the entirety of that debt." Preston froze. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "Debt? What debt? The estate is paid off. My grandfather was wealthy." "Your grandfather was brilliant," Beatrice finally spoke, stepping down off the porch. She walked slowly toward Preston, the memory of his cruelty fueling every step. "He knew you were circling him like vultures. He knew you were waiting for him to die, so you could pave over his legacy and sell it to the highest bidder. So he took all the real wealth, hid it, and left you the empty, mortgaged shell." "You're lying!" Lucille shrieked, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a life preserver. "Gregory Finch would have told us." "Finch didn't know," Reynolds countered. "Arthur kept this completely compartmentalized. The foreclosure proceedings were filed at 8:00 a.m. this morning. The bank has already frozen the corporate assets and your personal accounts pending seizure of the manor. You are currently trespassing on bank-owned property." Preston looked physically ill. He stumbled back, looking wildly between Beatrice, the sheriff, and the heavy machinery he suddenly couldn't afford to pay for. No, this can't happen. The developers, the contracts, I'll be ruined." "You already are," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of sympathy. "Wait," Preston gasped, a desperate, manic light entering his eyes. He pointed a shaking finger at Beatrice. "If the money isn't in the estate, where is it? Where did the $40 million go?" Beatrice looked down at the mud beneath their feet. She thought of the cold, dark tunnel, the vault door, and the meticulously stacked gold. She looked back at Preston, offering him the same cold, pitying smile he had given her in the lawyer's office just a week prior. "It went to the person who bought the cottage," Beatrice said softly. "The $1 joke, remember?" Lucille let out a strangled, breathless sound and actually sank against the side of the Range Rover, her legs giving out. Preston stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the catastrophic reality of his greed finally crushed him. He had handed her the keys to an $85 million fortune for a single, crumpled dollar bill. "Sheriff," Reynolds said politely, breaking the stunned silence, "my client would like these individuals removed from her property boundary immediately. And as the primary shareholder of the trust that is currently purchasing the distressed debt of the manor from Morgan Stanley, she would also like them escorted off the main estate by sunset." The sheriff nodded grimly. "You heard him, folks. Back in the car. It's time to go." Beatrice watched in silence as the bulldozer backed away, its treads retreating from her land. She watched as Preston, broken and humiliated, helped his weeping mother into their luxury car, a car that would likely be repossessed by the end of the week. They drove away slowly, the arrogance completely stripped from them, leaving only the hollow ruin they had brought upon themselves. The mist began to clear, giving way to bright, piercing morning sunlight that filtered through the ancient oak trees. Beatrice turned back to the East groundskeeper's cottage. It was still dilapidated. It still lacked a roof, plumbing, and heat. But as she looked at the weathered stone, she no longer saw a rotting ruin. She saw the foundation of an empire. Over the next 2 years, Beatrice didn't demolish the cottage. She meticulously restored it, using the original blueprints and local craftsmen to bring it back to its 1920s glory. It became her private sanctuary. As for the main manor, she bought it back from the bank for pennies on the dollar, but she didn't live in it. Honoring her grandfather's true legacy, she transformed the sprawling estate into the Arthur Pendleton Historical Library and Botanical Gardens, open to the public for free. The vault beneath the earth remained her secret, a silent testament to a man who knew that true wealth wasn't measured by the price of a house, but by the loyalty of the person holding the keys. And framed in the grand entryway of the new library, sitting behind bulletproof glass, was a single crumpled $1 bill. A daily reminder to everyone who entered: never mock what you do not understand, and never underestimate the girl holding the crowbar. If you love this incredible true-to-life story of ultimate karma and family betrayal, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button to support Beatrice's triumph. Subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping hidden treasure stories, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is living well. What would you do with the fortune? Let us know in the comments below.